Hello and welcome to my channel, and the subject of this video will be 80s albums which changed nothing forever. 10 of them. Sarcasm is the lowest form of wit, but the highest form of intelligence, which is a quote apparently by Oscar Wilde. I love sarcasm, so in my book it means it was probably wrong on both counts. That aside, the title of this video makes it pretty plain that I'm ridiculing titles used by YouTube creators containing absurd claims about the life-changing qualities of their subjects. I've not as yet seen videos entitled The Bum Note That Changed Music Forever or The Silent Fart That Changed Parliamentary Democracy Forever, but I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if it were to happen at some point. To balance that viewpoint a touch, all viewers and creators, myself included, are slaves to the algorithm in varying degrees. Moving on, in any era, for one reason or another, there are always albums that some listeners may love that get little or no recognition. This video highlights 10 such albums from the 1980s that I have. Curiously, to my mind anyway, several of them I have on vinyl only, partly because they either never made it onto CD or, if they did, with limited availability. Onto the albums, they're in chronological order. First of all, it's Second Empire Justice by Blitz from 1983. Changing musical direction can be fraught with risk, and it proved to be a fatal move for Blitz. They had started out as an oi punk band and released a critically acclaimed album in that genre, Voice of a Generation. That was on No Future Records. So when they released their fifth single, New Age, on Future Records, which contained the line, "All I've got to say is the kids don't care," it was pretty plain Blitz weren't happy with the limitations of the oi sound and scene. It was well and truly confirmed with the release of their second album, Second Empire Justice. Fast guitars and angst were replaced with something more akin to post-punk bands Joy Division, New Order, Killing Joke and The Sound. It was brave of them to follow their instincts, but the album was a flop, and within a year, they were no more. Nevertheless, it remains an album I really enjoy. Is it as high a level as the bands I just mentioned? No, but it's a decent effort, and tracks such as Underground, Telecommunication, Skin and HMK Grey all demonstrate that they weren't far away from the bands they were aspiring to be more like. But it was a very crowded marketplace, and it didn't have the space for Blitz. Also from 1983 was Get Out and Walk by the Farmers Boys. Jangly pop meets synth pop with quirky East Anglian humour. Although their music had elements in common with the likes of the Monochrome Set, the Smiths, and Postcard Records label bands such as Orange Juice and Joseph K, being from a place like Norwich probably damned the Farmers Boys with a terminal uncoolness, from which not even a degree of patronage by John Peel could save them. Still, their debut album Get Out and Walk is one I have a certain fondness for. The album has 11 tracks, plus there was a free 12-inch single that had remixes of the excellent Soft Drink, For You, probably one of the best investments I ever made, as well as of earlier single Muck It Out. With probably one of the best investments I ever made, my memory has failed me because I'm sure it was a phrase used in a TV advertising campaign by one of the many, at the time, high street building societies. I can't remember which one though. The album opener, Matter of Fact, and closer, Who Needs It, are also favourites of mine. A year later, they almost had a hit single with a cover of Cliff Richard's In the Country, but that seemed like a desperate idea on the part of their label, EMI. Sadly, the Farmers Boys' career proved to be a short one. A second album was released in 1985, but they split not long after. Ricochet Days by Modern English came out in 1984. This was Modern English's third album on 4AD Records and if you're a fan of artists on the label, you'll recognise the cover as being one by Vaughan Oliver, aka 23 Envelope. For modern English, this album was a further step away from the post-punk of Mesh and Lace, their debut, towards a more synth-pop type sound. Critically, it wasn't well received and accusations of pretentiousness flew around. Possibly that's because of the band including non-standard instrumentation. As well as a string quartet, there are parts using oboe, cor anglais, tabla and congas. I can't say that bothered me as it imbued the album with a character uncommon for its time. The content of the lyrics is also quite light, with Rainbow's End, Spinning Me Round, Hands Across the Sea and Blue Waves all containing nice hooks at a higher tempo than the rest of the tracks. However, it's the more elaborate ones that come out on top for me. The title track, Heart, Machines and Chapter 12 are all superb. The CD version of the album contains the 12-inch remix of Chapter 12, perhaps my favourite 12-inch remix of the 1980s. Naturally, it's built on the original album version, but has enough of its own identity to make it an outstanding track in its own right, with none of the clumsy edits that ruined many a 12-inch remix. Again from 1984 is Gross Out by Mark Riley with the Creepers. Since the 1990s, Mark Riley is probably best known for being a BBC radio DJ, first at Radio 1 and then on Six Music. Prior to this, between 1979 and 1982, he had been a member of The Fall, at various times playing guitar, bass and keyboards. Unsurprisingly, Riley became just another name in the very long list of those booted out of The Fall by Marquis Smith. So in 1984, Mark Riley with the Creepers released this, their debut album, followed by a further 4 until they disbanded in 1987. The album doesn't stray too far from what you'd expect from The Fall. In fact, The Fall's guitarist, Craig Scanlon, makes a guest appearance on a couple of the tracks. Surreal lyrics come to the fore on Here We Go Dowd and Make Joe, and in contrast with Snipe and Claptrap, there's a more angry tone, directed towards Marquis Smith perhaps. At just over 31 minutes, a short album which is only available on vinyl. 3 of the other 4 albums never saw a release on CD either, so hopefully one day a label like Cherry Red will acquire the rights to gather them all up into a nice box set. Yet another from 1984 is Slow to Fade by Red Guitars. After their first 3 singles, Good Technology, Fact and Steel Town, I initially thought of Slow to Fade as a disappointment. Aspects of social commentary were limited and the album's songs had more in common with the single B-sides Paris, France and Within Four Walls. A few listens later and I came to the conclusion that I got it all wrong. Upon release it would probably have been described as alternative or indie rock. Given how nebulous those terms are, I'd say in the main it blends new wave, post-punk, and with the guitar, a world music feel along the lines of King Sunny Ade and his African beats. It makes for a refreshing listen, and Jerry Kidd's distinctive voice and bittersweet lyrics finish it off perfectly. Notable tracks are Crocodile Tears, Astronomy, Marimba Jive, and Sting in the Tail. The CD version includes the 3 singles I mentioned, therefore a comprehensive collection of their early material. Jerry Kidd left the band shortly after the album came out. A new vocalist was recruited and one more album followed, Tales of the Expected, which is okay but no match to Slow to Fade, an impressive debut. Before I go any further, here's a brief look at what's in the planning stages for this channel. On to 1985 and its Nausea by Executive Slacks. I first heard Executive Slacks via their contribution to the Illuminated Records mix album Heavy Duty Brakes. Therefore, I had no hesitation in buying Nausea once I tracked it down. Although it's not on Illuminated Records, the two albums are linked by virtue of their producer, ex-Killing Joke bassist Youth. What you have here is an early form of electro-industrial rock, complete with buzzing saw-like guitars. There are traces of what would later be heard from the likes of Nine Inch Nails. In and Out and the title track are my favourites, but there's lots to get your teeth into with the other tracks. One connection that I didn't make at the time was the philosophical references in the track titles. Nausea is a novel by Jean-Paul Sartre, Aguijongo, a book by Friedrich Nietzsche, Sisyphus, presumably a nod towards the myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus, and Magot is possibly a reference to the Parisian Café Les Deux Magots, where people like Sartre and Camus hung out. There's nothing in the sleeve notes to explain why those titles were chosen, so I guess the reason will forever remain a mystery. Regardless of the rationale behind it, it's a terrific album. Next is Express by Love and Rockets from 1986. When Bauhaus split in 1983, guitarist Daniel Ash and drummer Kevin Haskins continued with their side project Tones on Tail, eventually releasing the intriguing album Pop in 1984. Bassist David J. recorded a solo album, Etiquette of Violence, and singer Peter Murphy teamed up with ex-Japan bass player Mick Karn to form Dali's Car. A reformation was proposed in 1984, but Murphy failed to turn up to a meeting to finalise it, leaving the others to work together as Love and Rockets. Following the psychedelically tinged Seventh Dream of Teenage Heaven, Express was their second album. Elements of psychedelia are still there, but there's more variety and style. The CD starts brilliantly with Angels and Devils, a drum and sax-dominated atmospheric instrumental. Next track, It Could Be Sunshine, is a stunner. It starts slowly before letting rip into a higher tempo, with Daniel Ash's guitar sounding absolutely fantastic. Kundalini Express chugs along nicely. There are electric and acoustic versions of All in My Mind, and along with Love Me, they provide the album's lighter moments. The down-tempo and dubby Holiday on the Moon is another favourite of mine. Love and Rockets also continued the Bauhaus tradition of greatly executed cover versions with their take on Ball of Confusion. Despite Love and Rockets making little impression in the UK, they were better received in the USA. Express, in my view, is the pick of their albums. Strange Cargo by William Orbit came out in 1987. William Orbit is an English musician whose main success over the years has been as a producer, having worked with Madonna, Prince, Queen and many, many others. Strange Cargo was his second album and the first in a 4-album series of Strange Cargo albums, so the 1987 album is in essence Volume 1. Sonically, it is very mid-late 80s, and if you think of the music for Miami Vice or The Equalizer, you're in the right area. It's sort of light electro sounding with Latin influences in places and Brian Eno-esque ambient textures also. The tracks are all instrumentals, and returning to the TV series link, you could speculate that William Orbit may have been throwing his hat into the ring for being considered as a writer of soundtracks. In some respects, many tracks have a half-finished feel, with the greater emphasis being on Orbit showing his flair for hooks and production. Ordinarily, those are qualities that I don't gravitate towards, but this is one of those albums that makes for ideal background music. There's nothing particularly challenging, it just trundles along in easy-going fashion, and when tracks or sections of them penetrate deeper into my consciousness, it's like momentarily being transported back to the late 80s. My favourite tracks include Fire and Mercy, Out of the Ice, Riding to Rio and Theme Dream. Dated, yes. Is that important? Not really. Staying in 1997, the album A Good Night Out was by Test Department. Of all the late 70s and early 80s industrial artists I'm aware of, Test Department were the most overtly political. For instance, their second album, Shoulder to Shoulder, released in 1985, was actually a collaboration between them and the South Wales Striking Miners Choir, with the proceeds from sales going to the miners' families. If you discount what were at the time cassette-only releases, A Good Night Out was their fourth album. Their earlier ones contained aggressive drums and percussion, especially metallic objects combined with technological features like the use of repeated samples to generate rhythms out of recordings of things like jackhammers and chainsaws. A good night out steps back from that to a degree by including instruments like bagpipes, didgeridoo, trumpets, and bugles. So, what's it like? The two sides are presented as Acts 1 and 2 of a critique of Britain under Margaret Thatcher. Lyrics make their point without descending into an expletive-laden rant, as many anarcho-punk bands would do. However, at times it sounds like cheesy romanticism, on the poem, generous terms, and on victory, for example. Demonomania, Cargill Shintula, We Shall Return No More, and the 53-word track title, which I'll shorten to Long Live British Democracy, are the highlights for me. It's an interesting album, and its approach perhaps paves the way for later albums by them, such as Pax Britannica. Cyborgs Revisited by Simply Saucer was released in 1989. I'm stretching the limit of my boundary for this video because this one was actually recorded between 1974 and 1978, but Simply Saucer never released an album while they were still in existence, and this one finally saw the light of day in 1989 with a later reissue containing some bonus tracks. In view of that, I think I can justify its inclusion, and besides, there's some damn fine stuff on it. Simply Saucer were from Hamilton, Ontario in Canada, and the liner notes for the album reference Syd Barrett-era Pink Floyd and early Velvet Underground as influences. They go on to make comparisons with Suicide and Silver Apples too. All in all, I'd say this album sits squarely in the proto-punk region, and the first 9 tracks, which comprise the original release, are all energetic, slightly strained, but above all else, excellent. The first 6 songs are from a studio session with electro rock, Instant Pleasure, and Mole Machine having some wonderfully manic parts. Tracks 7 through to 9 were recorded live one Saturday afternoon in 1975 on a shopping centre rooftop of all places, and all 3 are stunners. The bonus material isn't quite as bizarre as what precedes it, yet still strong enough to make the overall package well worth getting if your taste in music straddles krautrock, 70s UK underground bands like Pink Fairies and Hawkwind, and early UK punk and post-punk. Albums like these are never likely to get much credit, so by doing this video I can at least feel that I've done my bit to make others aware of their existence, and in general terms promote the idea that finding things you may like often requires a leap of faith to trust yourself and go exploring rather than depending on mainstream media outlets to provide a less self-interested take on what there actually is out there. In the description below is a link to a playlist containing 1 track from each of the albums I've spoken about. Finally, if you've made it this far, thanks for watching.